The Eldrazi are a mysterious group of creatures that come from the space between worlds, otherwise known as the Blind Eternities. The many physical forms they take are actually expressions of the will of the titans of their species, Ulamog, Emrakul, and Kozilek. In terms of their design, the Eldrazi have a few core principles based on which of these titans they are representing. Some have a bony face mask, others are covered in eyes, and they frequently have many tendril-like limbs. But overall, they exude a sense of constant flux, a feeling that they are always mid-transformation, possibly a reflection of the changing priorities of the titans whose plans they enact. The most immediate cultural touchstone for the Eldrazi is the work of the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, who often wrote stories about inconceivably large and powerful monsters that could bend or even break the sanity of a community. But in adapting this written tradition into a visual medium that requires distinct creatures, Wizards has fallen into a similar trap as their predecessors in this space. Media that wants to signal a lineage with Lovecraftian horror often relies on the spaghetti monster trope of depicting tentacled beings that can serve as a stand-in for a larger aesthetic model. While doing research, I found this image of Hello Cthulhu, and it's hard to imagine anything further away from Lovecraft's Eldritch Horror than the original Japanese cartoon, even despite her cold, dead, lifeless eyes. Which goes to show how much space we've put between the visual elements of Lovecraft's stories and their original narrative impact. But Lovecraft was much more concerned with animating the space of doubt or concern between the victim and the monster than he was with the creature's specific anatomy. The drama of his stories comes from the characters' sudden terror as they become aware of an immensely uncaring and destructive force that they cannot comprehend. A part of that confusion is built on an inability even to distinguish the shape of the beast. So to have the Eldrazi Titans not only on full display in the bright Zendikari sun, but also tucked neatly into the frame of a playing card, in part defeats that horrific purpose. Which isn't to say that this kind of storytelling is impossible within the strictures of a Magic card. Wizards has actually done it successfully in the past, although even then it hasn't stuck. Exhibit A here is the Dark Depths reprint in the recent Ultimate Masters set. The mysterious creature known as Marit Lage had previously gained much of its power and allure from the unknowable quality of its depictions. It had either been tinted or obscured under ice or shrouded in an ethereal fog. The perspective switch of the new print has value in itself, because it establishes an artistic conversation and tradition by showing the other end of this frightening encounter. But in doing so, Marit Lage becomes a bit more familiar to us, a bit more recognizable, and I would argue, a bit less evocative as well. We don't have to lose sleep over the fact that the Eldrazi might not be a perfect representation of Lovecraft's original intent. In fact, as we'll see in a little bit, there's plenty of reasons why you might want to actively avoid remaining faithful to his original vision. But before we get there, I thought we'd look into a little bit more of the Eldrazi's cultural heritage. Only this time, we may need to clear out some space. We got a big boy coming through. The original Godzilla came out less than a decade after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and before we even see the giant lizard, it invokes this dark past. The monster first appears as a flash in the sky, and then as a concussive force that pummels a small seaside town. It moves through the space, toppling buildings and landscape alike, crashing through everything in its path. The villagers duck for cover and pin themselves to the ground in fear, and although it comes from the ocean, the wreckage the creature brings is similar to that of an airstrike. What starts as subtext, though, soon becomes explicit, because it is revealed that the arrival of Godzilla is the direct result of American H-bomb testing in the Pacific, which has unsettled the monster's underwater environment. As with the Eldrazi Titans, Godzilla needed to be awoken from a long slumber, but this monster brought a whole genre with it. The Kaiju film, which we could loosely translate as great creature or monster, is all about massive beings that destroy cityscapes, usually as an act of vengeance against the overreaching ambitions of industry or science. Die-hard fans of the genre wouldn't bat an eye if Ulamog, Emrakul, or Kozilek appeared on screen, because they slot in nicely with the other lumbering monstrosities that define this style of movie. Rhoads and McCorkle argue that this first Godzilla movie fulfilled a fantasy for the original Japanese viewers, who might have welcomed the opportunity to see themselves as the victims of World War II, and not co-participants and co-perpetrators of its many horrors. But subsequent kaiju movies would broaden their ecological concerns. Godzilla also tracked the misgivings of a country that found itself adopting the same technology that had been the means of their destruction in the past. The entry in the franchise from 1995 features a new take on the beast called Burning Godzilla that was characterized by the swaths of lava-like skin coursing along its body. As Japan became one of the world leaders in nuclear energy, Godzilla morphed to adapt with a new set of fears. That was less a representation of a bomb than a reactor, threatening a meltdown that could set the atmosphere on fire. The standard moral arc of the kaiju film is maybe best expressed in Mothra vs. Godzilla, where the giant lizard eventually tracks down the businessmen who are responsible for disrupting the natural world. The monster finds them in their hotel room and then just absolutely dunks on them, burying them in the same cache they made from their parasitic practices. The Eldrazi could be considered as a darker representation of this narrative model, because in their case, they combine the awesome might of the kaiju with the exploitative impulse of the capitalists. The Eldrazi Titans consume all the natural energy of a world, leaving the plane first as a barren wasteland, and then, when there's absolutely nothing left, letting it break apart in a flash of light. Sadly, in this way, they might provide a more realistic representation of environmental politics as they exist today. In her book, This Changes Everything, activist and author Naomi Klein makes a case that we haven't efficiently responded to climate change because... Actually, you know what? Let's bring her in. How did it go again?
The central argument of the book is that the reason why we haven't responded is because climate change struck us at the worst possible moment in human history, and that moment was the late 1980s, that this crisis has suffered from a case of epic bad timing.
You don't really have to convince me that the 80s were a hellhole from which we were lucky to escape. But let's play out the thought experiment.
So what else was happening in 1988? Well, it was the year before the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was this triumphant moment for what Joseph Stiglitz has called market fundamentalism, this idea that we need to remove all boundaries to multinational corporations, crack the world market wide open.
And in doing so, we allowed the creation of megacorporations out of the major fossil fuel companies. They became titans of industry, you might say. This is perhaps where the story of the Eldrazi can be most helpful to us today. They aid us in visualizing a problem whose scope is otherwise hard to imagine, in part because its main perpetrators have done a great job of distracting us.
Well, this comes down to a very old story about the fact that it is, it's hard to take on the most powerful forces in society. I mean, certainly if we're talking about fossil fuel companies, we're talking about the richest companies in the history of money. ExxonMobil made $45 billion in a single year. That's more than any company has ever made. So, it's easier to ask individuals to take shorter showers and put on sweaters than it is to try to gain control over a company that can run attack ads against you, that can make your life really hard. And so it's been this theory of the low-hanging fruit. Let's go after the easy stuff. And the easy stuff actually is passing on the bill to the people who can least afford to pay and letting those powerful forces off the hook.
I mentioned earlier in the video that Lovecraft might be a bad model because of his rampant xenophobia. And if you're interested in that, H-Bomber Guy has a great video on the subject that I'll link in the description.
Bad as I remember.
What the fuck is nautical looking supposed to mean, Howard? What does it even mean?
Oh, that clip. But I actually think that the way the Eldrazi skew away from Lovecraft's existential ambiguity is key to communicating their ecological message. Climate change is not the unknowable or ungraspable other. It is the danger staring us straight in the face that we both choose and are encouraged to turn away from. And what can we do about it? Well, on that point, Naomi Klein, Godzilla, and the allies of Zendikar all agree.
We have to ask the polluters, we have to demand that the polluters pay.